music's on, the disco ball has dropped, and it's time to get this party started. You're listening to episode 17 of DiscoTrek, a Star Trek Discovery After Party podcast here on the Tricorder Transmissions Network. I'm your host, Heather Barker, and with me, as always, my favorite Jeff, my favorite Gorn. It's Jeff Hewlett. Hi, Jeff.
Hello, Heather. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm excited to be here today to reward our wonderful Patreon members and give them a platform to talk about the first season of Star Trek Discovery. This is the first supplemental of many, we hope, that is a special reward for our Patreon supporters.
Yeah, this is awesome. We have a lot more coming down the pike, but we were just discussing, I think, on our, we had a meeting last night. We have a lot more Patreon benefits coming out pretty soon. And actually, we posted the first unedited version of Reading Trek to the Patreon feed yesterday. And
I think that includes an interview with Dayton Ward, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah. So before we pop into the show, I'd like to introduce everyone first. We have quite a selection of wonderful guests today. The first, you know him very well at this point. He's been on DiscoTrek. He's been on Shore Leave. He is Mr. Las Vegas himself, John Krikorian. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, guys. What a treat to be here with all of you.
Well, thank you. I mean, we owe you all the thanks for supporting us and coming on. We're so glad that you got to participate and excited to talk about Discovery with you. Another guest is one of our great STLV friends. He has a podcaster in his own right, our good friend Thad Haight. Hi, Thad. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm happy to be back on the Tricorder Transmissions.
We are happy to have you as always and so grateful for your support. Our next two voices are new to our network, but still family in their own right. Our first is Greg Rozier. Hi, Greg. It's nice to have you here.
Hello. It's great to be here. Good morning and or good afternoon, depending on where everybody is.
I think for everybody, but John and I, it's afternoonish. We're still in the late morning phase. Okay, and then our other great friend, my longtime friend, but new to the network, is Mark Anbinder. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Heather. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and or morning to all of you. I actually got to hear you talking about me on the episode a couple of weeks ago after I became one of your Patreon supporters, and that tickled my fancy. That was great.
Yay. Well, it was a nice surprise to see you join us on Patreon, and just great to have been your friend for like 12 years or something crazy at this point. Like I said, Mark knew me before I was hardcore Trekkie, so he's seen me evolve. And I guess he's happy that I've gone full Trekkie at this point, right? Because
very happy, and I would like to think that those of us here when you lived in Ithaca had a little something to do with it.
I think so, for sure. All right. So, as I said, today we are talking about our reactions to the first season of Star Trek Discovery. But first, especially because this is a Patreon episode, we wanted to take a minute to thank everyone for supporting, reminding you guys that we will continue to do these shows, so you will have more opportunities as a Patreon supporter to join us. Jeff, do you want to let people know how they can become a Patreon supporter? And then I think we may have gotten another family member.
Yeah, we sure did. So if you're interested in becoming a supporter of the Tricorder Transmissions Network, you can visit us on patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions, or you can go to our website, thetricordertransmissions.com, and you'll see a big orange Patreon link in the upper right-hand corner. So as we've said a couple times already, becoming a patron gives you instant access to our unedited episodes, including DiscoTrek and Shore Leave. And now we've also added Reading Trek, and we have arrangements to add several of our other shows to the unedited feed as well. So you'll have tons of extra content for becoming a Patreon patron. And we did get a brand new Patreon family member, Crystal Pisano. Thank you so much for joining up with our Patreon family. We really appreciate you being a supporter of our show.
Yes, we do. It's always great to see Twitter family, Facebook family, anyone out there, sometimes we get patrons that we don't even know, and that's always super awesome because it's great to know that we're reaching far past our little circle of STLV-ites and Twitter-ites. So it's been really great watching watching our little Patreon family grow over the past, what, not even a year?
Yeah, it hasn't even been a year. Maybe the last 8-9 months. Really, it's been growing really fast.
Yep. Yep, we are not big fans of advertisements on our podcast, so we forego that, thankfully, by the generosity of our Patreon supporters. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope that you're ready to talk about Star Trek Discovery. I think that I probably don't need to say this, but Black Alert. Going forward, there will be spoilers, so if you haven't watched the first season or any of Star Trek Discovery, I don't know what you're doing here, but please go watch it. You can stream the entire thing right now on CBS All Access. Come back and then listen to our show. So one of the things I wanted to do first, since we have new voices, is to get to know everybody. We don't often ask about how you got into Star Trek on the show, but I think it's pertinent to the discussion. It's kind of nice to know everyone's history. So John, do you want to give us a quick breakdown of what got you into Star Trek and how long you've been a fan?
Sure. My very earliest memories of Star Trek was probably watching it cross-legged in front of the TV as a little kid on reruns growing up in New York City on WPIX. It was on every night, I want to say at 5 or 6 o'clock. And I was there every night just watching it and soaking it all up. And so that was in reruns, of course, in the 70s. And then, of course, I just kept on watching it and enjoying it. And I started going to conventions when I was in high school. And they were actually creation conventions, I think, in New York City. And so I would go there, and I saw lots of the original cast back then, really enjoyed it. And I always stayed with it. And at one time in my life, I was actually joining the military to get money for college. And hilariously, he put 3 different jobs in front of me when I was thinking of joining. And he offered me 3 different routes. And one of them was nuclear engineering on a submarine. And I said, "Oh my God, that's Scotty! That's one of Scotty's guys. I have to do that." And I told him, "Take all these other jobs out. We're not talking about any of that now. This is the only thing we're talking about." And that's what I went and did. And actually, my entire professional career came off of that decision. So in a really profound way, Star Trek influenced my life in a really big way. By every other job I've had since then has come out of that decision. It's just been a great thing in my life, and I've loved it ever since. And really, it's just about an optimistic sense of the future, which makes me very happy to think about.
Awesome. I love that story. Anybody that knows me knows how much I love talking about how Star Trek changes and saves lives. So these stories, there should be a podcast about these stories, I think. All right. So Thad, how about you? What brought you to Star Trek?
For me, it was also watching Star Trek in syndication every night when I was a kid. I'm a little younger, so for me it was our local Fox affiliate played TOS and TNG back to back every weeknight, and I got into it from there. And well, the rest is history. I have been a religious follower of Star Trek ever since. I've only really been part of the fandom, like interacting with other fans, for about a year now, and I'm really glad I started.
And now you even have a podcast. I mean, you have several podcasts, but you have a Star Trek specific podcast.
Well, just the 2 podcasts, actually.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, well, that was actually, yeah, it was, because not to digress too much, but on the Stargate podcast that I do with my friend Stuart, we were talking about it, and we're like, well, I love Stargate, but I'm like even more into Star Trek. Why am I not also doing a Star Trek podcast? So, well, but now I am.
Now you are. Super awesome. Well, you'll have to let us know where to find you at the end of the show. Greg, what about you? What's your Star Trek story?
Well, I also got started watching the original series of syndication back in the 70s. I'll admit that back then I was more of a Star Wars kid, but I loved any science fiction and watched Star Trek. And but I did, I've kept with it, and it quickly became my favorite, and have been a fan ever since.
Awesome. Mark, what about you?
Well, I'm old enough to have been around when Star Trek originally aired, but wasn't watching it because I was an infant. But when the reruns hit, just like Greg, I was watching, but I was kind of introduced to Star Trek by my father, who is a retired book publisher. And one of the lines that he worked on when I was a kid was Star Trek books for Random House and Ballantine. And he managed projects for the Enterprise blueprints, for the Star Trek Concordance,
Oh, wow.
and for a little photo book called Trek or Treat that it just occurred to me was basically a 1970s precursor of internet memes. It was basically stills taken from Star Trek episodes with crazy captions on them and fake quotes. And it had not occurred to me until just now that that's exactly what we put on the internet. We put goofy photos of Spock with crazy sayings that Spock would never actually say. And that's what my father created 45 years ago. So I'm going to have to tell him that. I think he's going to love that.
Dig something out of the basement. Like,
I am sure I still have a copy of that somewhere. I'm going to find it. Because I had one, if not two or three of each thing that he published, though I guess some of it may have been destroyed in my basement flood a couple of years ago. But I'll look. But anyway, I had all of the toys. I went to science fiction conventions as a kid in New York City. But I also then met some science fiction fans at Cornell when I was a college student and started getting more involved in fandom besides walking around conventions with a friend or two. Watched the reruns. On Saturday nights, actually, there were 3 episodes in a row, uncut and uninterrupted with no commercials, on a PBS station from the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, that we got on our cable. Then I met some Starfleet members at a convention in New York City and joined up just over 30 years ago. So I've been a member of Starfleet, the International Star Trek Fan Association, for just over 30 years now. And I was very involved in Starfleet and the Starfleet Marine Corps for quite a while, much less so now. But if you remember the Penn Jillette show Identity, where contestants had to figure out who the people standing on stage were, I was almost one of the people standing on stage as the Vice Commander Starfleet. And that would have been a lot of fun. So I would have gotten to fly to Los Angeles and be on the show, but they canceled the show before my episode came around. I've had people come to my house to watch Voyager when no one could get it on cable in Ithaca, and people come to my house to watch Discovery because all of a sudden Discovery isn't just on television. You have to pay for something else in order to watch it. So I like to consider myself both a Star Trek fan and a Star Trek pusher.
I love it. And I love sharing Discovery. Thankfully, I don't think anyone at CBS listens to this, at least not all access, but I'm a big proponent of, okay, if the one thing keeping people away from Star Trek Discovery was paying for it, then let's share my account. Like, to me, it's not what CBS All Access wants us to do. But I'm for doing whatever I can to bring people into the show. And at this point, like, I'm done arguing about it. I just want to get more people to watch Discovery. And I think watching it in a group setting sounds like a lot of fun. I know a lot of people have done that across the world, really, whether it's just someone's living room or at a theater. It's been really cool to watch that. I've just been watching at home, but anyway, Jeff, I think we've kind of talked about our stories a little bit, so I'm thinking we can skip over our Star Trek stories, or did you want to do your Cliff's Notes version?
Well, I could do the super Cliff Notes version. So yeah, I watched it in syndication, TOS and syndication as a child in the late 70s and in the 80s, and that's kind of, it hooked me. And I guess everybody out there who's listening to this has probably heard me say how much I identified with the Spock character and how much he was inspiring to me as a young kid. So I was hooked on TOS, and I've been a Star Trek fan ever since, and I've been able to watch all of the series as they aired live on TV all the way up through Discovery.
Which is pretty awesome. As I noted earlier, I went full Trekkie later in life. I'd watched Star Trek Enterprise when it aired, and I can't say that it appealed to me greatly as a woman, and there's probably a reason why there. But I watched Nemesis was my first Star Trek film in the theater, so it holds a special place in my heart, despite all the drama that surrounds that film. But it was really the 2009 JJ movie that convinced me to go to a Star Trek only convention. And between deciding to go to the convention and going, I think I watched the entirety of the Star Trek catalog that I hadn't seen aside from the animated series. And that was almost 10 years ago. This will be my 10th consecutive STLV Star Trek convention this August. And I live and breathe Star Trek now. I've gone full Trekkie, and I'll never, ever go back. So there. So let's go ahead. I figured we would start off with our first reactions to the season as a whole. Again, this is an organic discussion. We're not formatted to how DiscoTrek normally works. So I don't mind if we bring up subjects at will, but let's go ahead and just start off with our first reactions. John, how did you feel about this season as a whole?
Wow. Big question. So I guess I have to break it down a little bit. As a production, I don't think Star Trek has ever looked as good. Just every element of what was put up on the screen was just a real treat and feast for the eyes. The cinematography, the costumes, the sets, the acting was fantastic. Just so much to enjoy. I really couldn't understand some of the story elements and some of the writing that went into it. I struggled a little bit, and I think some of what I think there might be influenced by some of the meta discussions about what's been going on outside the show and Brian Fuller's departure and how there was this giant mess of no scripts with production dates coming, and I think that might influence how some of those stories got put together in a rush because some things didn't quite hold together for me. But I am very optimistic about where the series is going. I am very optimistic about what we'll see now that they've had a chance to catch their breath in between seasons. So I have a lot of hope for the future. And I liked what I saw. But I think it was more of a prelude than actually the first act in a lot of ways. But I will also say that I don't think that that's unusual for a lot of Star Trek series when you go back and look at that first season, with the possible exception of TOS, which had an incredibly strong first season.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard across the board. A lot of people feel that this is the best first season of Star Trek, which, I think is great. And for me, I think I'd probably agree with it. I think as a season overall, it was certainly very, very strong. But as we know, like every first season of Star Trek or any series has its growing pains. And I think that's an important point, talking about what was going on behind the scenes, because that's not stuff that we're generally privy to as fans. And one thing I've tried to make a point to talk about throughout the season is the influence of behind the scenes and higher ups and how that affects Star Trek as a whole. So Thad, how about you? What's your general overall reaction?
Well, my first immediate reaction is that I loved it. I thought, as you just mentioned, I think this is the best first season of any Star Trek series, with the possible exception of TOS. But the first season of TOS did have a couple stinkers, so I think it's even better than that. There was no single episode that I wish I hadn't watched. I enjoyed all of them. Some were better than others. There were a few moments that I did not particularly care for, but overall, I thought it was great. The acting was great, especially Mary Wiseman, Sinigo Martin Green, and Anthony Rapp especially were amazing in their roles. And I just am excited for more and sad that it'll be so long until we get more.
If it makes you feel any better, they're starting to film in April. So at least we'll get some, like, maybe maybe some photos. I don't know. I know that person got fired for leaking the first shot of the Klingons having lunch one time. But it's going to be a wait. But I'm glad that maybe we'll get some snippets and casting information since we have some new roles to cast. Curious to see. Well, Greg, what about you?
Well, at the risk of repeating some things that my friends here have already said, I loved it. The writing and acting was top notch, and so were the special effects and the production values. Trek has never looked better, certainly on TV. You know, I as a longtime fan, I could nitpick a few things, but those would just be my own design choices. I'm not going to speak negatively about any of that. Overall, I loved it.
Well, you are welcome to have negative opinions, because here at DiscoTrek, that's something that we value. We can talk about things that we don't like in a constructive way. So we can do that maybe a little later in the podcast. Mark, what about you?
Well, I think one of the reasons this was such a strong season, and one of the reasons that we can sit back and say that this was one of the strongest first seasons of any Star Trek series ever, was that they were telling a story. They really planned out this season in such a way that they were telling a story to us. It was almost a 15-hour movie, which would have been exhausting. You'd want to make sure you could get up and get a little more popcorn. But they were really, even though there were a couple of episodic elements to it, there were a couple of, especially early on, there were some episodes that were really focused on that hour as a self-contained unit. I think, especially looking back from the vantage point that we have now, we can see that we were always along a single story arc, and they were telling us a story over the course of the last several months. And that gave them the opportunity to focus on the quality, to build a lot of things into the story that we weren't necessarily aware of at the time, but were part of that arc. But at the same time, they made an enormous effort, and it was very clear throughout the season, to place us within the Star Trek universe, whether it was the little things like bridge sound effects, just the background noises that you hear when you're on the bridge, and just very subtle things like that, or a tribble in Lorca's ready room. And I want to talk more about the tribble later, but just little things like that, to almost Easter eggs for the Star Trek fan audience, so that we can say, all right, there's an Andorian here. These people who are producing this for us have the same reverence for Star Trek and its 50-plus year history that we have. And I think there was an appreciation that was very much evident from the producers all along for the fan base. And you can argue about the way it was presented to us as something that we have to pay for. And I would also love to talk about that more in a bit. But I think what was presented to us as a first season of a Star Trek series was outstanding and was very much within the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, it shocks me that people don't see how well the writers, the producers, really just everyone involved has, if they weren't familiar with Star Trek, they fully embraced Star Trek. But so many of them were. Like Ted Carter Hall himself has been a Star Trek fan since he was a child. And the fact that some people just don't see the respect that they had and the knowledge that they had, it boggles my mind. And I felt like they did a pretty good job of keeping the fan service to something that was not distracting. Like, I know throughout the season there were a couple things here and there that Jeff and I pointed out that stuck out, but I never felt that it was too much. Not necessarily always subtle, but not overbearing.
Sure, and there's a line that you have to be careful crossing, where it's not too much of a token bit of fan service. I don't think they were just messing with us. I don't think it was just, okay, fine, here's a tribble. I think they were actually intentionally building something within the Star Trek universe, and that that meant something to me as a viewer and as a longtime fan. They were actually making that effort.
Yeah, me too. I think a lot of people struggled with the Kelvin universe and feeling that JJ didn't respect Star Trek. And that's a conversation for a whole other Patreon supplemental. But to me, I think that everyone who's worked on Star Trek has respected it, has shown the respect. But I think with Discovery especially, it was just extremely evident. And so, again, it's just shocking to hear that some people don't quite get it. Jeff, so we've talked a little bit about our own reactions, but do you want to refresh everyone?
Yeah, sure. I'll do an abridged version. So, overall happy with the majority of season 1. As I've said a couple times on DiscoTrek before, it was a little darker than I preferred, but I had to get used to a whole different style of storytelling, and I understand that it needs to be modernized for today's audiences, so I didn't let that really distract me from enjoying it. I think there was enough of a balance between things that were in there to satisfy existing fans and try to draw in new audiences. So I'm actually interested to see if there's any new Star Trek fans that have gotten into the franchise based on seeing Discovery as their first Star Trek. That would be kind of cool to have that discussion. I don't really have anything overly negative to say. The one thing I'm going to have to see as the future goes on, if any episodes of Discovery pop up in my mind as hey, I want to sit down and just watch one episode, one specific one, kind of like we do with all the other series. We have specific favorites that we like to rewatch over and over, or I'll feel like I have to watch the entire series to binge watch again. So that's one thing I'm going to have to see how that goes in the future. But overall, looking forward to season 2. I think the ending was satisfying, and I think we have a lot to look forward to with these characters and seeing how they develop into the future.
Yep. I think as everyone knows by now, I loved Discovery. Overall, I very much agree that this season had its struggles here and there, but compared to other Star Trek first seasons, I think this did a really great job. There was definitely some disruption in the background and what was happening that I think fell into how the story played out overall. I do miss having twice as many episodes and more opportunity for character deep dives and everything. But I think that the season did a good job of establishing Discovery as its own Star Trek. I think that they'll still be able to do that despite having Captain Pike in the Enterprise in season 2. I'm really interested to see where we go from here, and I'm hoping that next season will be a more coherent season across the board, with some bigger world building and more character development. I think we definitely got character development out of this season. It's just not to the same level as we would in a regular, longer season of Star Trek. But that's okay. This Star Trek has become my Star Trek for personal reasons, and I really couldn't be happier. I think that the cast for Discovery is probably the strongest cast that we've seen. I'm not going to say that they're all better actors than other Star Trek series, but there is a certain level of acting that everybody brought. And I just really enjoyed seeing the cast and watching them grow across the season. So since Mark brought it up earlier, I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about the way that Discovery was presented to us via behind a paywall. Obviously, we all watched it, so we paid for it in some respect. I went all the way and paid for the commercial-free $9.99 version, and right now I still am paying for it. But Mark, did you want to start us off on that discussion?
Sure, I would be happy to talk about that. We actually ran a piece in 14850 magazine that you can find on 14850.com about the idea of having to pay for Star Trek and how we would not have gotten the production quality of Star Trek with a free television series. we probably wouldn't have gotten Star Trek at all. And a friend of mine who actually has written for 14850 magazine multiple times over the years wrote that it started out as a Facebook post, and I thought that would make a great article. And I really think he's right. We would not have gotten Star Trek, or we would not have gotten this quality of Star Trek. But something Jeff said a couple of minutes ago makes me wonder, did CBS lose an opportunity to bring new viewers in by taking the series off the flagship broadcast network so quickly? Did having the first hour being on free television and then making people go see the second hour, the second part of the premiere on CBS All Access, limit the audience? And I think if they had had that entire 2-hour opener on free television, they might have had a better shot at drawing people into paying for CBS All Access. But I definitely agree that the revenue stream for CBS All Access is why we got the Star Trek we got, why we got the level, the quality, some of the A-list actors that we got. We would not have seen some of these stunning names that demand high salaries if this were free episodic television.
I agree with that. I agree with that totally. I one thought that I had, and I think there's a really simple solution to this for CBS. I know we always say we don't think anyone from CBS is listening, and maybe this is something they have on their roadmap, but I think it would be a really great idea before season 2 starts for them to run Discovery on free television, and just to get people who weren't subscribers, show them what they were missing and say, okay, so here's season 1, and season 2 was launching on X date, and subscribe to CBS All Access to get it 8 months, 9 months ahead of when free television will have it.
I think you're right. That's not a bad idea. And one of the reasons that I ended up watching Dexter and paying for Showtime is that during a writer's strike several years ago, CBS actually ran the first season of Dexter on the broadcast network. And of course, being Dexter, they had to do some slicing and dicing and dubbing of some of the language and some of the nudity to put that on broadcast TV. But I would never have even heard of Dexter, or I would have heard of it, but I wouldn't have even considered watching it and paying for Showtime. And I'm still paying for Showtime, and it's because they put that series on free TV for a little while.
I'm reminded of what you guys were talking about right at the front of the show, which is how we all got into Star Trek, and so many of us began watching it as youngsters when it was on TV. And I know, speaking just personally, if I'd have went to my parents when I was 8 years old and said, I need to spend $10 a month to watch a show, I don't think I would have gotten anywhere with that. So I think in this incarnation of Star Trek, I think it's more incumbent upon us as fans to bring people in and to do things like this and to talk about the show and to talk to other people about it, because I think the discoverability of it is seriously limited with it being behind a paywall. But having said that, I do think All Access is just fine. I mean, if you were to say, hey, I'll give you 15 hours of, well, not 15 hours. If we put all the episodes together, it's maybe 10 and a half hours, minus the commercials and stuff. So I'll sell you 10 and a half hours of brand new high quality Star Trek for, $50. Would you pay for that? I mean, to me, that's the cost of a night out at the movies for the family. I would absolutely do that. So to me, it wasn't an issue of it, but I can certainly see that I think it's going to be more challenging for other people to discover it. I made a pun. Sorry.
One thing that occurred to me is there's an enormous viewership for Star Trek in the movie theater because of the JJ verse, the Kelvin Universe movies. Are those people tuning in for Discovery? Did they all say, oh, hey, I liked that Star Trek movie, so obviously I should watch the beginning of the Star Trek Discovery series? Did those people go watch? Because I know that one of the things that Star Trek had to do with those movies was attract a new movie-going audience, because the fans weren't enough. Just the people who've been going to see Star Trek movies for years weren't enough for them. They wanted the blockbuster audience. They wanted the action movie audience. And I think they got a lot of that. But did that jump over? I'd be really curious to see whether we are seeing Star Trek fans at conventions now. And you guys can probably tell us whether you're seeing that at STLV or at other conventions. Are those movie fans coming in and becoming part of Star Trek fandom in other ways?
Yes, the movie fans for sure. And I remember in 2009 when I went to STLV, they asked specifically, who's here for the first time, and I feel like it was almost half the people there that raised their hands and cheered. And throughout my time at STLV, we always talk to our friends about how they got into Star Trek, and we know a lot of people that, again, similar to me, like they may have watched Star Trek and liked Star Trek, but they'd never been to a Star Trek convention or something like that. As far as Discovery, I mean, I think that number one, the answer is that yes, by putting it behind a paywall, it certainly restricted accessibility. And while I think that there are new people coming into Star Trek that watch Discovery, I think there's a fraction of those people are fans that had never watched Star Trek and maybe saw that first episode and then joined. I think the rest are friends and family of current Star Trek fans that are maybe watching it with family. And I wish that CBS would give us the statistics on stuff. Like they announced some of the numbers, I think, for CBS All Access, and that basically it had met and exceeded their expectations for signups. But I'm curious because I already know people who are canceling. Like it's done, they've watched the season, whether they liked it or not, they're still going ahead and canceling, and they're going to resubscribe when the show comes back on. And me personally, because I do a podcast, I need to still be able to watch it. I think that at the point where I can buy it digitally or on DVD, assuming that's before next April, I'll cancel CBS All Access and then just rely on the digital version or whatnot. But it's tough. We've asked people who have come on the show, like, do you know anyone that's watching the Star Trek Discovery as their first Star Trek? And there are some people out there, but it's a little few and far between. I feel like the majority of people watching Discovery are already tried and true Star Trek fans. A lot of the people and general public had no idea there was a new Star Trek. And then when I would tell them it was behind a paywall, they were like, oh, forget it, which is sad.
I would say that I expect Discovery to come out digitally and on disc not long before season 2 hits, because that's how most premium content works. Like HBO and Showtime, they release their shows not long before the next season comes out.
I'm curious too, since it's available on Netflix in other countries, if they'll expand it, at least season 1 to Netflix in the US before season 2 comes out. Possibly expand the audience further that way.
I heard that being a potential rumor too. I mean, I think that would be great because, Discovery was a great show. And I had even asked people, like, if Star Trek Discovery if it wasn't Star Trek, would you watch it? Like, would you think it's good? And a lot of people said, yeah, like it's still good science fiction. And then there were people that were like, I'd like it better if it didn't say Star Trek and it was just its own show. But I really hope that at some point we find out these numbers, because I know, like, last STLV, we had many of the actors, producers, writers, makeup. Glenn Hetrick and Neville Page were there. And overall, like, I felt that the Discovery vibe was positive and strong. I don't find many discussions late night at the bars talking about how much we hate what the Klingons look like. And I think that part of that is just that we tend to be nicer to each other in person than we are when we can hide behind our keyboard.
Or you're hanging out at the wrong bars.
Yeah. But the conversation there was positive, and people were looking forward to it.
I do have a little bit of data that I was able to find about this, which was that the CBS earnings call, which of course, is very exciting to listen to. But if you dive into that, Les Moonves, who's in charge of CBS, I believe the data here, if what I'm looking at is correct, is that the CBS All Access has around 2.5 million subscribers, and they saw their subscriptions double over the past year. And that's taken out of their earnings call. So, I mean, we don't know what because they have the full metrics and data, but that's, I think, all they put out on their earnings call, which I think is a good sign for Star Trek. And seeing that it got renewed for the second season is also a positive sign as well.
Yeah, I'm just curious to see like how strong that viewership is going to stay until like what's the drop off going to be. And I don't know that they'll give us those numbers, right?
Almost certainly not.
Anybody have anything else they want to say about CBS All Access?
I looked through the catalog before I canceled my subscription to see if there's anything else that would, I would want to watch while I still had my account live, but I don't recall seeing any other original content on there. It seemed just all older CBS owned properties on the channel. So
The Good Fight is the big one. The Good Fight, which was the sequel series to The Good Wife, is the big one for me. And I want to finish watching that before I cancel my subscription between seasons, because it's excellent. It's a really good show, and it's without Juliana Margulies, but it's still great. It carries on where The Good Wife left off, and I think they're doing some cool stuff with it.
Yeah,
And
plus they're bringing in, there's a comedy thing with Will Ferrell and somebody else that they're doing, and then they're bringing back Twilight Zone by who's doing that? Jordan Peele, I think.
Yeah.
That could be fun.
So they do have already original programming, and then they're trying to introduce more, but it's definitely not at the rate as something like Netflix. And I mean, some would say that even Netflix is oversaturated right now.
it is,
Sure.
and I'm going to throw it out there too that, I don't know if everybody else's financial situation is similar, but I'm not made of money, so I have to really pick and choose what streaming services I'm going to subscribe to, and there are just so many of them now. I have Netflix and Amazon Prime, but can I really support adding CBS full time along with, I have an Apple Music subscription, so I have all these monthly charges going out, and eventually there's going to be a breaking point where people aren't
That all adds up fast.
Yeah, people aren't going to be able to really swing 5 or 6 subscription services.
And that's why I definitely want to unsubscribe from CBS All Access for the stretch of months when there isn't new Discovery. But I'll come back. I will come back for it. And if there's a new Twilight Zone, I will probably want to watch that as well. But one of the things that I wanted to add is that I have not had any of the technical problems that Heather has mentioned on DiscoTrek several times.
Oh.
I've had rock solid,
Same here.
great performance from CBS All Access. Now, I also have not a fancy sound system, and one friend from a long ago Starfleet chapter in the Philadelphia area talks about how ridiculous it is that she doesn't get 5.1
Yes.
surround sound from CBS
I wanted
All
to complain
Access.
about that.
And I am not enough of an audiophile to care about that, but I do know that there are people who do care about it, and it does seem odd. And you would almost think they must be producing this in surround sound, or
They are.
must at least be able to. Oh, that's right. I actually do recall hearing that on Netflix in Europe you get surround sound.
Yep. And that's why it's so annoying, because I'm not a huge audiophile, but I do have a really nice home theater setup with surround sound speakers. And it's very annoying that Star Trek, with its, awesome space stuff, which would be perfect for surround sound, is stereo.
I always used to test my surround system after I set it up with the opening sequence to First Contact, because it had such a great space battle sequence there. It was so fun to listen to in surround. So that is a very weird issue with All Access, that you get it in one place and not in another. And one final thing, and I know I've said this on DiscoTrek before, so forgive me, listeners, but one other major gripe I had about this, and this is really something so simple to fix, and this may be an Apple TV thing, but why is the newest episode of Discovery always at the end of the list?
Yes.
It's never at the front.
Across the board, yeah.
Oh my God.
I think that overall, I mean, CBS All Access has some catching up to do with the rest of the streaming services. I use pretty much, Amazon Prime, Netflix, Hulu, and I don't have any issues with those like I do with CBS All Access. And I have watched it exclusively on PlayStation 4, and I don't know if that's part of it. I've watched it in 3 different locations at this point. And generally have issues with everything. And then the weirdest thing, like the finale, when you assume so many people were watching, like right when that dropped, I really had very little issue. But when I went to rewatch it on like Monday at 4:00 Colorado time, it's glitching so bad I couldn't even watch it. So I think for certain there needs to be some work done on CBS All Access. I had hoped that Discovery would have given them the incentive to get the problems fixed. I know it's not always that easy, and there's a lot more involved than just CBS fixing something in their coding or whatnot. But hopefully by 2019, we won't have these issues, or I won't have these issues. I guess you Northeasterners are just spoiled.
And I don't even think I have that great an internet connection, but I think it probably depends a lot on the infrastructure that they're using. And I have no idea what's behind CBS All Access, what kind of technology they're using, what providers they're using to get that content across the planet.
They're clearly using
curious.
They're clearly using a content delivery network, probably Akamai or something like that. But the issue for me is very similar to what Heather's experiencing, in that on Sunday nights, I get a rock solid connection. It works great. I watch the episode, no problems. Then the next day I try to rewatch it and it won't work. Right. And I wonder if maybe they turn off, they don't want to pay the content delivery people after Sunday night, and keep the connection up. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could speculate about. But even separate from the streaming, the app itself is not fit for purpose.
No.
No 10-second skip forward. You can't binge it and have it jump directly to the next episode correctly. It's they really got to up their game there on that.
I have it on PS4 and I have it on my laptop.
Skipping forward or backward or both?
Forward and backward, but it doesn't tell you for how long. I think maybe it's like 10 seconds, but it doesn't actually tell you.
Oh, because I watch it on my actual computer, and it doesn't seem to do that. And I don't think the native app does it. I think it has a 10-second back, but not a forward. But I might be wrong on that.
Well, I think we can all agree that CBS All Access has some work to do. I will say overall, I don't regret paying my $9.99 a month for the show. I think that the production quality of the show alone made it worth every penny, although I also don't have a great sound system, so I probably would have been upset to find that with the cinematic, high quality production that we were presented, you'd think they would have gotten the sound up to those standards as well. So John proposed a topic, and I think it sounds interesting to delve into. So John, do you want to talk about your idea here? Not your idea, but how about you just talk and I'll stop talking.
Sure enough, Heather, I'm game. So I was thinking a lot about where I felt that the season could have been improved and where it fell short for me, because there was so much positive stuff, but I think there were some, I'll just call them EBIs, even better ifs. And one of the main things for me is seeing characters grow and develop and change over time. And one of the things that I think was missing is that in the balance of what they put together for the season, they really overemphasize the action elements at the expense of the characters. And as I think about it, the only characters that really had significant changes and development and growth over the season was Burnham, Saru to a lesser degree, Tilly to an even lesser degree, and maybe a little bit of Stamets. But there really wasn't that kind of development. And so if you looked at, for instance, just to get into the weeds a little bit, if you look at an episode like What's Past is Prologue, right? That episode really was fighting and explosions, right? And we're going to fight and have explosions, and we're going to have more fist fights and more explosions, and we're going to have, poison gas, and we're going to be killing all these people. And, it was well done, and I enjoyed the fights and all that, but you didn't see the development of the characters overall. And so when you look at like that whole bridge crew, sort of the semi-anonymous bridge crew, and I know there's a whole discussion to be had there about, the Detmers and Arium and all those, they didn't have those character moments. And I think a lot of fans were so desperate for that, to learn more about these characters and to see them do something in the show that wasn't just pushing buttons and giving status reports, but to actually grow and develop and change. And I missed that. And part of me just wonders, from a meta perspective, is this, part of CBS All Access and making a business decision to emphasize the action adventure elements because they feel it's more accessible. I certainly understand that from a business perspective, but I do miss that in the show, that we're not getting an ensemble. We're really focusing on just a few characters, and we're not seeing a lot of other stuff.
I think we got a lot of character development on a few characters and not necessarily the ones that you would have expected. Like, we got a lot more of Tilly than I expected to at the beginning of the season. I thought she was almost going to be a throwaway caricature when we started seeing her. But I think we got a lot more from her, and we may have the opportunity in a second season to explore some more of the other characters that we haven't seen as much from yet.
In what way do you think she's developed? I mean, I saw that, she did great. She was fantastic, and Mary Wiseman was fantastic, and I enjoyed seeing her, and she did great. She had great comic relief bits, and she did some great work on the show. But, how did the character change as a result of the first season? That's the question, right? And her deciding to become a captain and all that, it was great, but it was a small moment, and I just wanted to see more. That's I think my critique.
Getting to see her as a captain, I think, was a huge step, and gives her the opportunity to say, all right, so this isn't such a ridiculous idea. I actually have some leadership in me. Maybe she won't be a mirror murderer kind of captain, but we've now seen her do that. We've seen her interact a little bit stoned in the second to last episode of the season. Got to see some more of her, just having fun. And it was more than just as the roommate. We got to see her stepping up and helping out with the mycelial network issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough for me because I've also heard people refer specifically to Tilly and that she was reduced to comic relief in the series. And so I'll say this, I think that, again, because of the 15 episode season, we lose the opportunity for the type of character development that we would see in any other first season of Star Trek with more episodes. I think that this season was more about getting to know who the characters are than fully developing, because I would even argue that I don't think Burnham really changed a whole lot. I think she was very much at the end who she was in the beginning. She was Starfleet by and by, despite her poor decision, which she, came around to understanding why that was bad and came around to understanding humanity. But I don't feel that any of the characters were like fully developed to a point where we saw a lot of change. I mean, yes, Saru, when we meet him, he's afraid of everything. And by the end of the season, he's an acting captain. So I would say that of all the characters, we probably saw the most change from someone like Saru. But with Tilly, she was certainly comic relief. And she started off as being the nervous roommate. She is a cadet, and as a cadet had to not only pretend to be a captain, but a kind of captain that was the complete opposite of who she was as a person. So imagine having to do that. She did so much sciencing in the background, as Mark noted, with the spore drive, and she almost filled the role of a ship's counselor in a way by trying to facilitate and encourage communication across the crew. She had her moment with Stamets and then with Burnham. So I feel like, well, she may not have changed in some great way, that she and the rest of the characters did at least evolve a little bit. And I do think that next season we'll probably see more true character development that we know.
I would definitely love to. I would love to see more from some of the background characters, or more likely, I suspect, the way TV production works, I think we will have some new characters introduced, and we'll get to see more of them. But I hope some of the folks that we've seen in the background for now.
Yep. Anybody else want to chime in, Greg?
Well, we were talking about what we'd want to see more of in the series in the first season. Okay. I did think that they did emphasize the serial nature a little more than I would have liked, in the sense that they every episode, or almost every episode, tried to leave it with a cliffhanger, wanting you to jump into the next episode and give you that anticipation. I would have liked to see more seeking out new life and new civilizations. There weren't very many, visits to appearances by alien races or visits to alien planets, which is what we kind of come to expect and want from Star Trek.
Yeah, I thought we'd see more on Pavo than we did, and we really got Pavo for one episode. By the second episode, that was really a follow-up to that one. We didn't even go, we didn't see the Pavans. There was really no tie-up there. And I did hear that the second season will have more of that. And I think, again, that just lends to the fact that there's not quite as much chaos, and they will have more time to plan some of those things out. But it's definitely part of Star Trek that we know and love that we didn't quite see in this season. Thad, anything to add?
Not really too much to add to that. You've covered most of what I would say, especially, I think we should have had a couple. We had Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad, which was mostly a self-contained story. But I feel like it would have been a little better and felt more like continuing the Star Trek legacy if they had 3 or 4 more. Because even if it was more like how DS9 was in the later seasons, where it was mostly serial, but they still had a couple standalone episodes.
It's tough because I enjoy the show for what it is, and I understand why they're doing it this way. And again, I hope that with more time and less behind the scenes drama, that next season will be a bit more coherent, because I loved Magic to Make the Sanest Man Go Mad. I thought that was such a fun episode, and it's probably one of my favorite episodes. And I heard from a lot of people that episode felt the most Star Trek to them. But then at the same time, when I'm looking at, well, how could we have made this season better, given more time to the story that was going on? I probably would have gotten rid of Mud altogether and those episodes and gone back and focused on things like deeper character development.
I think the big advantage of that episode was to get Burnham and us invested in Ash Tyler.
Yeah, for sure. Because it was a great scene watching their relationship develop there. Definitely. But it certainly seems that most people agree that we're having a bit of struggle with the 15 episode format, and I honestly am trying to imagine how to make a 15 episode series feel like a 23 episode series.
Yeah, I agree with you, Heather. I think this is a big symptom of the abridged length of the series itself, and not really having enough time to really flesh out every character and let us know as much as we could about every character. So hopefully, like we were saying, next season we'll get kind of at least some sort of a return to episodic Star Trek in some way that'll give us time to focus on more of the bridge crew characters and more of the other characters that we see often on the show but don't get a lot from.
I think I've decided that the mirror universe is like wasabi. You just need a little bit. Too much, and it kind of ruins the whole thing.
Yeah, and I enjoyed the mirror universe stuff. Like I like the first episode where we went there and the makeover episode, I guess, where they put everyone in the uniforms and whatnot. But again, there's just things like, okay, Michelle Yeoh was great. There was her whole lot, story. And then eventually she just is like, oh, no, not I give up, but okay, I don't want to kill Burnham again. So I'm going to go off and do my thing, which I was just like, okay. That was one place where the story fell a bit short for me. And obviously that's just setting up for seeing her again in the future.
We can hope.
Yeah, I think it's likely. I think she's not going to be in every episode or anything like that. But just like with Jason Isaacs, having those big names, they're not going to be there for the entirety of the series. They can prove me wrong, but we'll see. Any other points about the format and how that affected things, or character development versus the amount of action?
I think that we're in a society where we've become almost used to shorter seasons with things like House of Cards and Game of Thrones, and the 26 episode season is so far in the past that I think we're getting more used to this, and we will just have to give them a little time. And even going back a decade and more to The Sopranos, this is the way that we get new content. We get a chunk of new episodes, then we have to wait a year and a half for more.
Yeah, I think so. I know, Mark, you wanted to talk a little bit about the Klingons, which I've typically checked out with the Klingons, but let's have the Klingon discussion. What did you want to say about the Klingons?
I would love to. I think there's a whole separate discussion that we could have about comparing what the Klingons looked like in the original series and what Klingons looked like in the Next Generation and the early movies with what we're seeing now. But I love that we have now created an entire mythos of what's going on in the Klingon Empire that we can use moving forward. We have, and I gather that the folks who are developing these ideas for the Klingons based some of their thoughts on John M. Ford's early Star Trek novel, The Final Reflection, which had houses and had games and had competitions.
Did that one have the Black Fleet? I know that the Black Fleet gets mentioned in one of the novels.
Yes.
So that was.
I believe you're right.
Yeah.
And I've been meaning to pull out that book and read it again, but I love the depth of characters, and the whole idea of honor came out of that book. And it was set up in a slightly odd way. It was one of the pocketbooks, Star Trek novels, and it was originally written by Ford as a very standalone Klingon story, and pocketbooks told him, sorry, Paramount is insisting that all Star Trek novels be connected to the characters that we know. And he said, fine, and kind of wrote a wrapper story around it that touches the Enterprise characters. But it was set in the past, kind of like we are set in the past now, but even further back. And I would say that anyone who appreciates the Klingons in Star Trek Discovery ought to go find that book. It's John M. Ford, The Final Reflection, and it really creates a great picture of what the Klingon Empire is or could be. And I'm curious how you all feel about the idea of Klingon houses, which was touched on a little bit in The Next Generation, but really has been fleshed out very well here.
Well, I just want to first of all endorse your approach because I completely agree that that book really does give depth to the Klingons. And in fact, I just want to add this one thing that Ron Moore, who wrote a lot of the Klingon episodes for Next Generation, said that he took a lot of what he put into the show directly from that book. He's admitted that. I think it's on one of the commentary tracks on the DVDs. So I personally loved the Klingons. I thought they were great. I find L'Rell a little strange, and we can maybe talk about that. But the Klingons overall as a concept in the show, I thought it was just fantastic. We got a sense of them really being aliens and having a different set of priorities and different thoughts and ways of being. I just thought it was fantastic. I loved everything about it.
So I agree with you, John. One of my biggest takeaways about the Klingons in Discovery versus other Trek series is they really felt ominous and villainous. And if you're looking back on the other series, of course, there were many instances where, the Klingons definitely seem, brutal, but Discovery's portrayal of the Klingons almost makes older portrayals seem, I don't want to say campy, but they felt like real heavyweight villains that I'd be scared to meet, in a dark alley. I think Heather said something similar on a prior DiscoTrek, but I really thought that they did a great job amping up the villainous nature of the Klingons and making them a much more menacing opponent to the Federation.
Instead of just swarthy guys with beards.
Yeah.
So I was curious, John, what you find weird about L'Rell.
Well, I just didn't understand exactly what the plan was. And I don't necessarily understand exactly what happened with the whole Voq transformation. I still find it weird how the whole thing just played out. It seemed to me that it really just got the short shrift. Like, oh, well, I'll go in and just do my my literal hand waving over his head and sort that all out, and we'll finish this whole Voq thing up in a page of dialogue and some cool sick bay hand waving. And I just thought that I just didn't get where she was going with this. And I found the whole ending of it just bizarre because here we have a Klingon and, she's got some connection to Cornwell. By the way, just got to say, love Cornwell and everything about it. But at the end of the whole series, at the end of the season, here she goes being put in charge. And so she's in front of a bunch of Klingons holding a piece of human tech in her hands and showing it to all these Klingons. And I'm thinking, they're going to kill her at the first microsecond of walking in there with some human tech in her hand saying, I'm in charge now. And I didn't feel like it was earned that the Federation could trust her to keep her side of the bargain. To me, that seemed like a crazy bet because if they lose the bet, they die. So that was a really dangerous game of Russian roulette. And I don't think that enough information was on their side to really trust her with that. So when I say that some of the story elements of the first season didn't hold together for me, that's some of the stuff that I'm thinking about. But the Klingons overall I thought were great. But L'Rell I just found really weird, and I didn't understand it, and it didn't logically hold together for me. But I'm sure other people have different opinions on it.
No, I agree. Yeah, we'll see what everyone else has to say, but that was, and I talked about this in one of our last episodes of DiscoTrek, but for a character who, when we met her, I was infatuated and I loved, she was so cunning and I felt like she's got something up her sleeve. She's going to be the puppet master here. And I fully expected her to be the, Empress of the Klingon Empire by the end of the war. I just didn't expect it to happen the way that it did. And I think that she may be one of the characters who suffered the most from this story not really being fleshed out beforehand. I agree with you that there's just a lot of ambiguity, I guess, with what the plan really was, aside from she was just going to use Voq use Voq as Ash Tyler to get onto the Discovery and then take the Discovery's technology back to the Klingon Empire. The end. That's the most basic explanation I can come up with, but she certainly didn't earn her win at the end of the season. And I know a lot of people did at least counter everything with the fact that they came to a peaceful conclusion instead of furthering the war, killing more people, etc. A lot of people liked the fact that it was Starfleet that turned around and basically gave L'Rell her power. But I, for one, would have much rather seen her achieve her power. Mary Chieffo is amazing, and the acting that she did underneath that makeup, especially with her eyes, like her eyes should get their own Emmy, but she was amazing, and I felt like it was a bit of a disservice to the character by the end of the season without how everything played out. Anybody else have any comments about L'Rell? Thad?
Second favorite Klingon eyes in Star Trek. After of course Robert O'Reilly is Gowron.
Yep, I was gonna say.
But yes, I agree with you. I feel like the ending, it could have worked, but because of how rushed it was, and that scene where the Klingons are laughing at her, and then she holds up the remote as if they're supposed to know what that is, and they all fall in line.
Yep.
It's like, what? What is that? But anyway, regardless of that, I would definitely agree that Mary Chieffo is amazing, and especially her interactions with the fans on Twitter has been great.
Yeah. Greg, what about you? Any thoughts on L'Rell?
Well, I did like Mary Chieffo, her portrayal as L'Rell. But along those same lines, I also expected Kenneth Mitchell to have a bigger part. I was really surprised that Kor was killed midway through the season. I expected that he was going to be the big bad Klingon and take his, that role would last till the big finale.
I really thought that all of those main Klingons would play a much larger part. I mean, I think we were all shocked to see Takuma go so quickly. And then Cole, and then L'Rell. I mean, okay, but at least she's not dead. I will say that when they blew up the sarcophagus ship, that was a pretty cool scene. But I was really sad. I was like, we got really one episode with Kenneth Mitchell, like in his true brilliance, and then he dies. And I was really bummed because I just thought, wow, this would have been a great villain to see more of over time instead of to really, really see strongly in one epised. Jeff, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that I agreed. He did go out in a blaze of glory, and and Kenneth Mitchell has been great on Twitter and interacting with the fans.
Yeah.
It would have been nice to see more of him.
It's nice that even after their characters die, they're still interacting with us online. Jeff, what about you? Any final thoughts on L'Rell?
Yeah, I agree with you, Heather. She started off really, really strong and really interesting and kind of got lost for a good part of the season. And then when they finally did really bring her back, it kind of was a wash. With you guys already talked about the way that the final episode ended, with her quote unquote taking control of the Klingons with the power of this bomb. I mean, we could probably sit around and rewrite the ending of this together for hours on end and probably come up with a lot of more interesting solutions. But I would have liked to have seen more of her throughout the series, and something tells me that they'll be bringing that character back at some point. So maybe there's more stuff planned for the future with her.
Oh, definitely. I think her and Ash Tyler together will bring something interesting to that story arc. So, Mark, since you led us with this topic, any final thoughts on L'Rell or the Klingons?
I'm fascinated by the idea of an Emmy just for eye acting. I'm wondering what other body parts deserve their own Emmys, but that's probably something we shouldn't dive too deep into.
I will say that Doug Jones would win every one.
You may be right, but it would be really difficult to have a category for ganglia when only one race that we're aware of has threat ganglia. Yes, I'm looking forward to seeing more of the Klingons. However, I have a sneaking suspicion that there's going to be a lot less emphasis on the Klingon Empire in future seasons of Discovery. I suspect we got a lot of it this time around, and they're probably not going to be as involved in coming seasons, partly because it would not make sense since we know that several years from now, the Klingons have been interacting very little with the Federation, and Enterprise and Captain Kirk and company are coming upon them and interacting with them more and more. So I think we're going to be seeing less, which is a shame because there's some cool stuff to explore there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the having the houses there and getting to see a little bit of the houses was great. Again, I would love to have seen more, and maybe we'll see that. Maybe we won't. All right. So on the subject of Klingons, there was a notable tribble that I think some of us at least thought would play a larger role. Mark, I think you had some thoughts about that.
I absolutely did. And one of the things that we know about Klingons from multiple past episodes in multiple different Star Trek series, Klingons and tribbles do not get along. And what a wasted opportunity, since we know that Captain Lorca has a tribble. What a wasted opportunity to not have that tribble flip out a little bit while Ash Tyler happens to be in the room. I can picture Captain Lorca looking over at the tribble with a confused expression, and Tyler getting a quick flash of hatred on his face and then moving on. And that would just be a cute little thing for us to appreciate. I almost wonder if there was more that was filmed with the tribble that ended up on the cutting room floor, or the proverbial cutting room floor, since I doubt there was actual film involved. But why didn't we get to see a little bit of that interaction of the tribble with our Klingon guest stars?
You know, that makes me think. I'm thinking of how cool it would have been to have seen that, but I'm also wondering at the same time if the writers would have thought that was too much of a tell that Ash was actually Voq, because there was a lot of back and forth and fan theory during the earlier Ash Tyler episodes, and if the tribble flipped out and Ash kind of had one of his flashback or PTSD moments because of the tribble and seeing it there and the Klingon flashes, and maybe that would have been too much too soon.
I can see that, but it almost makes me wonder why that tribble was there.
Yeah.
You would think they would have done something with the tribble other than just having it be there.
It was the old Klingon tribble switcheroo. They were messing with us.
You know what it could have been? I mean, since Lorca was researching all of these weapons to try to help overthrow, the Terran Empire and take the throne for himself, maybe part of him thought that, maybe if I beam some Quadra Triticale over to the mothership and then beam the tribbles in, there'll just be too many tribbles and it'll destabilize and make it easier for me to get in there or something. I don't know.
Except so many years before the trouble with tribbles, did anyone know what a tribble was? Where did it come from? I want to know.
Well, they do have a home world. It said that they have a home world.
Yeah.
But we've never seen it.
I kind of want there to be more to this story. I don't know if we'll ever get to see it, but I kind of want there to be more to that tribble being in Lorca's ready room.
I guess we'll have to wait for the fan fiction. So the tribble is one of the things, like right along with the black badges, that we noticed and we talked about, and we're like, what role is it going to play? It's got to be there for a reason. And then nope, not at all. So it's like, was it as much of a little bit of fan service, similar to Lorca's, Shop of Horrors, all his creatures? We had the Gorn skeleton, we had a Horda, tiny little Horda in there, Cardassian bowls. I think he had a whole collection, a menagerie. And I thought, oh, well, we're going to find out more about this. And why does he have this room? And then when they talk about the room, they just talk about the weapons. I very much felt the same way. I thought it was going to play a larger role, and I thought the tribble would have something to do with the reveal. And that was a fan theory that I heard from other people. And then it didn't.
It could even have been an intentional misdirect.
It could have been. But I do also wonder, like, what got cut. Because some of these episodes, they were just too short, especially Vaulting Ambition. And I listened to Brandon Shamatala and Amy Nelson over on Trek FM did an interview with Hanali Culpepper was the writer of Vaulting Ambition, and they asked her about the fact that the episode was, I think 37 minutes long, and why it was so short. And she said that her final cut had actually been maybe 5 or 7 minutes longer. But she did talk a bit about like scenes that were cut and everything. So important reminder that we don't get to see a lot of what gets filmed, and maybe that's what happened to the Black Badges, and certainly that may have been what happened to the Tribble. So I think our final discussion point for the podcast, proposed by Mr. John Krikorian, is talking a little bit about canon. And so I think that probably one of the penultimate scenes from this season came at the very, very end and has led to some controversy online, of course. And that was when Discovery came face to face with the USS Enterprise, commanded by Captain Pike. So, John, do you want to lead us off on a discussion about that scene, and then further discussion into our thoughts on canon?
Sure, I can do a little bit of stage setting, although I think I'm probably not the best person to talk about this in a lot of ways because I'm not a canon defender. I know I'm probably going to regret saying this, especially when people start tweeting at me, I guess. But I don't really feel that there is a Star Trek canon. I don't believe it actually exists. Star Trek isn't a show that has ever, in any incarnation, strived to be internally consistent with itself. There are many things we get which are major reveals or major things that happen that are then discarded and we never hear of again. Historical events, things that happen in characters' lives. So I was not one of those people that got really wrapped around the axle about, well, we didn't know that Spock had a sister and this and that and the other thing. Well, the proper shape of the Bussard collectors on the Enterprise is this, that, or the other. And it's just not something that's affected me. But I know that it's a big deal for a lot of people. And a lot of people feel really strongly about it, that it has to be internally consistent. And I see people really struggling with some of these things. And I thought that it might be worthwhile to see where all of you stand on it, because I'm quite sanguine about it. It really doesn't bother me. I think Star Trek is not necessarily about rigid adherence to necessarily holding on to things they put into the show before, but more about a sense of the future. And so that's where I come down on it. But I know that a lot of people feel differently, and I thought it might be worthwhile talking about it.
Sure. So let's go around the table. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Definitely agree that it's worth leaving room to explore beyond what we've seen in the past. I think if we stayed entirely within the world that we've seen before, it would be unnecessarily limiting. I am a little worried about joining up with Captain Pike and USS Enterprise, and I hope that we don't spend too much time on it. I was actually a little surprised to see Alex Kurtzman talking on After Trek at the end of the Discovery season about how they were heading for that moment all season, that they started planning out the season knowing that they were aiming for that meeting with Enterprise. And that almost bothers me. I kind of wanted them to be telling their own new story and leaving Enterprise safely outside the story that we're telling now. Have it be part of the mythology, have it be part of what you know is going on outside, maybe even mention it occasionally. But having Enterprise come swooshing up feels to me like a cop-out. Are we now joining the cast and crew of USS Enterprise already in progress? That just feels weird, and I hope we don't spend too much time on it. I'd like Discovery to develop its own canon.
Yeah, I agree. I pretty much said the same thing the other week in DiscoTrek on how I felt about the finale. And I think that there is, I don't know, part of this I think bleeds over from the novels, which are not canon as far as canon goes. But with Discovery, they're at least doing a good job of incorporating storylines across the board. Like Michael's, the story of how her parents were killed came right from Desperate Hours, which was the first Discovery book. And I know that Alex Kurtzman specified that they have questions to answer regarding the Spock-Burnham relationship. And so I think that's part of the reason. I'll just throw my thing out there. I thought I was super excited to see the Enterprise just because I'm a geek and that was amazing. But I was simultaneously giving it side eye because I would much rather just have not had it at all. And again, have it be like a secondary storyline, maybe in season 2 or just in an episode here or there, versus ending an entire series about a new ship and a new crew with something that we've already seen. It was fan service to the extreme. And I get that it's going to tie into the story because of Burnham's relationship with Spock and Sarek. But I think that for me, I think I would have rather seen a final, even just that final scene of them, going to warp in the Discovery, as a solidified crew. I think like that would have been for me a more rewarding ending than this quasi cliffhanger, a special guest appearance of the Enterprise.
I kind of have to admit that as a longtime Star Trek fan, I'm looking forward to seeing what they do visually with a ship that we know so well in a new universe where the production quality is so different. The production values and the starship design is so different. And we got a tiny glimpse of what the Discovery version of Enterprise looks like. And I admit, I do want to see a little bit more. I want to see what it's going to look like on the inside, how good a job they do of merging what we've seen for the last 50 years into a new production environment. But I do hope we get to play with Enterprise for an episode or maybe 2 and then have them go away.
Yeah.
But
I also want to see gooseneck communication panels. It's the only thing I want.
Absolutely. And chicken sandwiches and coffee. But I want to touch on something else that you mentioned, Heather, which is that some of the backstory for Burnham comes out of Desperate Hours. I'm okay with that. I think having canon expand into some of the novels that are coming out alongside the movies, alongside the television shows, is fine with me. Having some of the story be external. And it's kind of something that Marvel has done very effectively, not as much with novelizations and standalone novels, but having some of the story that they're telling appear in a comic book, having some of the story that they're telling appear in a TV series, and having some of the story that they're telling appear in a major motion picture, and having all of those bits of story kind of interact with one another. And you're not missing a huge amount if you don't happen to be watching that television series or reading that comic. But if you are, you get just a little bit more. So I would be okay with CBS and the Star Trek universe including some of these novels and saying, yeah, this is part of the same story that we're telling.
They've kind of said like it's canon until it's not, basically.
Sure.
And yeah, Desperate Hours was great. And in my opinion, Drastic Measures was even better. The next novel coming out is supposed to be focused on Saru. That comes out on my birthday, June 5th. So I've got that pre-ordered, and I haven't read any of the recent comics, so I'm missing what's gone on there. But it's certainly a good way to drive people to purchase merchandise and bring more money to Star Trek, which just ends up making more Star Trek.
Was it Desperate Measures that you were talking about in the Trek Reads podcast that you were just appearing on?
Drastic Measures 1 and 2. And so we talked, I think they already did one for Desperate Hours. We'll do Drastic Measures, and then I'll be back for the Saru book, which I don't have the name of it right in front of me. But yeah, that'll be late June sometime. So yes, please listen to Reading Trek to hear our review of the book. It's in 2 parts and is followed up by an interview with author Dayton Ward.
I really did enjoy the comics that are coming out, by the way. They're telling the backstory of Takuvma and how he grew up and how he fell into his beliefs and so forth. And I just really enjoyed them.
Fascinating. Yeah, because Drastic Measures is about, Prime Giorgio and Prime Lorca. So yeah, it's about characters that are, one we never saw, we assume is dead, and one we know is dead, but the background there was still relevant to the rest of the story. And I thought that Desperate Hours did a really great job of incorporating the USS Enterprise and Pike and Spock. And so because I've already read that book and I've seen Enterprise there, like I'm not as bothered by potentially having them in season 2. So highly recommend that you read the books and listen to Reading Trek. But I want to give everyone else a chance to chime in here about seeing the Enterprise and thoughts on canon. So how about Greg? Why don't you take it from here?
Well, I mean, I enjoy discussing canon just like any Trek fan, and I certainly appreciate the continuity when it shows up on screen. But I'm also very accepting of revisions and changes. We want this to look like a 2018 TV show, so that's why I tend not to nitpick when something such as the Klingons or the Enterprise doesn't look exactly like it did 50 years ago. And one of the things that I always say is that all Trek, and the series, the movies, the episodes, kind of watch them through a blurry lens. We're accepting of errors in dialogue or some production thing or special effects. So like I said, we want something to be accessible by 2018 audience. So I'm accepting of changes, and I thought the Enterprise at the end of the series looked great. It didn't look the same, but it looked great. I kind of want to see a little bit more of what they do with the Enterprise, but on the other hand, I don't want it to take over the show. I want this to be about the Discovery and its crew. I think it'd be great if at the beginning of the first episode of the next season, you see Pike and his crew on screen, and they say, "Thanks for the adventure, thanks for the assist, Godspeed on the rest of your adventures," and then the Discovery heads off to get their new captain.
I like that we're all pretty much on board. We have yet to find a canonista. Thad, what about you? Are you a canonista?
Well, I love to nitpick as much as every other Trekkie, but no, I am not a canonista. I think that obviously things are not going to look exactly the same as they did with 1960s technology and a 1960s budget. I think the new Enterprise looks great. In fact, I prefer this Enterprise to the Kelvin Enterprise because it looks much more like the original one.
Yeah, I thought it was really pretty. I don't know. I'll save my thoughts for last. But Jeff, what about you?
Yeah, I don't think you can call me a canonista. I think I'm a little more in line with John and Greg's comments before. In my own mind, I've always considered any televised Trek series and any commercially released film to theaters as quote unquote canon, but I think the argument can be made for a lot of other things around that to be included. So I've never really looked at the visual style of different series as an indicator of whether or not it's canon. Versus Enterprise versus TOS, and the technology on the NX-01 being better than what was in TOS on the Enterprise, things like that. I never really look at it that way. They were all a product of their time and the technology that was available. And I think since we've seen, televised Star Trek be decanonized retroactively, looking back at the animated series specifically, you can say, well, yesteryear is canon, but the rest of the series is not. So it's really hard to argue any canon stance if the official stance keeps changing. What's to say that 20 years from now, they decanonized the last 2 seasons of Enterprise or something? Because, I don't know, just for the sake of argument. So I've just developed my own definition of it in my head. Anything televised and any commercially released film I consider canon. And I think I said a lot about what I thought about the Enterprise showing up in Discovery at the end on our last episode, so I'll just give a little short recap. I'm excited to see it because I being a TOS guy, growing up with TOS, I've always been curious about the adventures of Captain Pike prior to Kirk taking over the ship. So I do hope that we do see some of that. I do agree that it shouldn't take over the show. It shouldn't be the basis of the full second season of Discovery, but it'll be nice to see at least a small handful of episodes where, you know, we get to be integrated with the crew of the Enterprise and see Pike and Number One and potentially Spock. So looking forward to that a little bit. And then hopefully, like everyone else says, maybe they'll depart from that, you know, partway through the season and get back to something new and exciting.
I think that, so for me, like Star Trek is not so much about what Star Trek looks like as it is who the people are, and this message of getting ourselves to a better future. It's just what is Star Trek? It's a great story with great characters that teaches us, you know, morals and ethics. And so I don't care what a ship looks like and that a ship looks different, and I don't care what Klingons look like and that they look a little different. And it's interesting that these debates have waged on throughout the entire season, and have even contributed to people not watching the series simply because they don't like how the Klingons look. Or they don't like that the ship has a spore drive, stuff like that. Like, to me, Star Trek teaches us to have an open mind. And I feel like a lot of people have completely overlooked or forgotten that, because of any fans, we should be those that are open-minded, and we should be able, you know, there's no one saying you have to love everything about Star Trek or every iteration of Star Trek, but at least be open-minded to what you see. And, you know, at the end of the day, you could still come back and say, no, I didn't really care for this. And that's completely fine and valid. But it's disheartening that some people won't even watch the show because it looks a little different or because of the storyline, stuff like that. I think one of the greatest lines I took from this season was in the final episode when Burnham said that we should be, you know, we're the torchbearers. And I've kind of taken that to heart. I find that these discussions around canon really have led to a very negative tone. And this isn't just Discovery, it's all of Star Trek. Like, we've been fans for a while. We've seen Nemesis. We've talked about, you know, bad episodes of other series. And when it comes to canon, I just wind up seeing a lot of negativity, negative interactions, and that's not something that I ever want to see. So, you know, to me, I find that canon is just a bit too restrictive, and a bit too negative in general. And I feel like, as someone who came into Trek at the level of fandom that I have later in my life, and I've since evolved to be a torchbearer of my own. I, especially after going to STLV, you know, I've built a family there, and at this point in my life, it has been proven that my Star Trek family is actually more supportive, and I don't know. They've been more supportive than my own family has through trying times in my life, and I think that speaks volumes. So I want more people like that in my life. I want more Star Trek fans. And so, you know, at the end of the day, sure, you can hate the J.J. Kelvin timeline, but you have to at least give it credit for bringing so much new blood into the franchise. And while Discovery may not be doing that at the same rate, I think that it's up to us as fans to be those torchbearers and to say, well, you know, I understand if you didn't want to pay for Discovery, but look, now you can binge it, or here's my login information, or just continue to do what we can to bring people into the franchise, because I think almost every fan I've met whether it was they watched Enterprise when it aired, or they went to see one of the Star Trek films in theaters. Once they did that, they went back and watched the entire catalog of Star Trek. So to me, it's just more important to have a positive effect on our fandom than to have a negative one. And so definitely not a canonista here. I won't ever be. I'm glad to be in similar company across the board here. And I think we're about to that time. So we'll go around the table and just give any final thoughts on the season. Let's go ahead and start off. How about with Thad? Final thoughts on the first season of Star Trek Discovery.
I want more. I would say I thought it was overall a very good season of Star Trek. And I think that I had a few issues with some things that happened. Some stuff that we didn't even cover, but have been covered on DiscoTrek before, so we don't need to get into. But I thought in general, it was great. And I love that Star Trek is back.
John, what about you?
So thank you, Heather. In the way that the first 2 episodes were sort of a prelude to the rest of the season, I feel like the whole season is a prelude to what's coming, because I think that there was just a lot of production issues and turnover in management that just caused a lot of chaos. And so I think some of that showed up in the writing with some decisions that they sort of had to work their way out of. And so I think that it only goes up from here. And I am excited, and I cannot wait to see what they bring us in season 2. I am totally excited, and I am fully on board for the ride.
Awesome. Greg, what about you?
Well, like I said before, I loved it. I think the entire season met my expectations. There are a few missteps along the way, but that goes with any TV show, even Star Trek. And I'm excited to see more.
All right. And Mark, final thoughts?
Well, I love Thad's idea that we are getting more new Star Trek. And that's really the biggest thing for me right now is Star Trek Discovery is more new Star Trek. And it's the first televised Star Trek we've gotten in several years. Enterprise was awesome. It was great to have that as something that we could enjoy. And that had its own prequel vibe to it, talking about things that were way off in the future in that case, and just a few years in the future now. I thought Discovery was beautiful. It was well acted. It was well done. It was well directed and a lot of fun. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what they're doing over the next however many seasons they manage to produce. I think there's a great opportunity for some terrific Star Trek stories to become part of the canon that we've been talking about, to become part of the fabric of the Star Trek universe, and to be the first Star Trek for a new generation of fans. I'm sure if we're talking about the next Star Trek series or the next batch of Star Trek movies in 10 years, in 20 years, there are going to be fans who became Star Trek fans because of Discovery. We may not have met them yet. We may not have heard from them yet, but they're out there. And that's part of the infinite diversity and infinite combinations that was what Star Trek was always all about. That's my thought.
I love that thought. Jeff, what about you?
Well, I will echo what our other guests have already said. Any new Star Trek, my doors are always wide open. I'm glad to see new stuff being made and adding to the existing catalog of Trek. And, we had a long period where we were unsure if we would ever get Star Trek back on TV. So I think this bodes very well for the future. And especially since we've been green-lighted for another season, I'm hoping this series continues on for a long, long time. And if it's always behind a paywall, I'll always be happy to pay into it and watch Star Trek and keep the series alive and bring in new fans and, keep this thing going. And any new Star Trek is good Star Trek in my mind.
I completely agree. I don't even know how to follow all of that up. I've said a lot about Discovery in these 17 episodes that we've spent talking about it. And I have a lot more to say down the road. It's an exciting time to be able to watch Star Trek, avoid Twitter until I can watch it, come back and, not only just talk to my closest friends on social media, but then to get to podcast about it and then spend my entire week listening to other Discovery podcasts. It's been a fun journey, and I'm especially grateful that we're living in a time where the actors, producers, and writers are all interactive on social media. It's just added as a very special element, watching it this way that wasn't there previously. Even though there was internet for Enterprise, it just wasn't the same experience. So incredibly grateful to get to do this. Excited to continue it and looking forward to getting together with everyone here on Patreon again sometime in the future to have another one of these chats. So before we wrap up the show, we like to let everyone know how to contact us. So let's go around the room and just give everyone social media handles. So let's start with, I guess, Mark, how can people find you on social media?
I'm very easy to find on social media. I am MHA Ithaca just about everywhere. MHA, my initials, Mark H. Anbinder, and then Ithaca, ITHACA. There are lots of misspellings of Ithaca, so I figure I should spell it out for you. I am Mark H. Anbinder on Facebook as well, and you can find me in the STLV group there. And I am looking forward to hearing from all of you again and talking to all of you again.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a patron. All right. How about Greg? How can we find you?
Well, the best place to get in touch with me or find me would be on Twitter. My handle there is Tar Heel Trek.
Very nice. And thank you for joining us and for supporting us and being our STLV friend. Are you going to make it to STLV this year?
Of course.
Okay.
I can't imagine not going any year from here on out.
Yay, that makes me happy. Well, looking forward to seeing you. Thad, how can we find you? And make sure to tell us about your podcast too.
All right. Well, I am Tyrannicus on Twitter. That's a TYRANICUS. You can also follow my Star Trek Voyager podcast. We're currently watching season 1 of Voyager, and that's a Delta Flyer. We're on Twitter at Delta Flyer Pod, or you can find us in any of your podcast apps, just Delta Flyer, or our website is deltaflyerpod.com.
Yeah, please check it out. I'm a subscriber. And as always, we appreciate you for being our friend and our patron. All right, John, how can we find Mr. Las Vegas?
Mr. Las Vegas. No, there is a Mr. Las Vegas, and I am not him. That's oh goodness, my mind is blanking. Wayne
Newton?
Wayne Newton. That's Mr. Las Vegas. Yeah, he's the real Mr. Las Vegas. But if people want to tweet at me or send their wails of grief or tributes of Quatlus, they can find me at JK in LV on the Twitter, and that is probably the best place to talk Trek with me. And also, I hang out in the unofficial Star Trek group on the Facebook.
All right. Jeff, I think we can find you in that same place, right?
Oh, yeah. I, along with you and Jesse, are administrators of the unofficial Star Trek Las Vegas convention group. And I am also Warp Factor Jeff on Twitter. And you could find out more about us and our shows and our website, right? I think, Heather, you're going to go over that.
Yeah, I usually handle that stuff. So you can find me on Twitter at LLAPosper, which is LLAPAWSPER. I am also that same handle on Instagram, if you like pictures of dogs. Aside from that, you can find our show DiscoTrek also on Twitter. It is disco_trek. And then the network is at Tricorder Show, and you can find us at the Tricorder Transmissions. We have a lot of shows and a lot more coming, so we hope that you'll join us. It's all the Star Treks apparently in one place, so we hope that you will find us there. Again, as always, thank you everyone for joining us here today. We've had a lot of fun chatting with you, and we plan to make these supplemental episodes a staple for our Patreon users. So if you're interested, check us out on Patreon. And it doesn't matter if you donate $1 or $10. Everyone who is a member gets to participate in these supplementals. We do cut them off at a group of 5, so you have to act fast, but there will be lots of opportunities in the future to participate. So until next time, thank you, everybody. Live long and prosper, and long live the Empire.